In order to understand the Battle of Westerplatte, it is necessary to begin long before the first shots were fired in September 1939. The story starts with the end of the First World War and the reshaping of Central and Eastern Europe that followed. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles created a new political map. The new Polish state was restored after more than a century of partitions, but it faced a serious problem. Poland needed access to the sea in order to trade and to survive economically. The main historic port of the region, the city of Danzig, had a population that was largely German and did not wish to be incorporated into Poland. As a compromise, the victorious powers created the Free City of Danzig, a semi-independent city-state under the protection of the League of Nations. Poland received a strip of territory known as the Polish Corridor, which connected the main body of Poland to the Baltic Sea. However, the main deep-water harbour that served the region remained at Danzig. Poland therefore received special rights inside the Free City: the right to use the port, to control certain railways and postal services, and to maintain a small military presence to support the movement of troops and supplies. These arrangements were complicated and often resented by the German majority in Danzig, and they created constant friction between Polish and German interests. Westerplatte was at the heart of this arrangement. It was a small sandy peninsula covered with trees and low vegetation, located at the entrance to the harbour of Danzig, near the mouth of the Vistula River. On maps of the time, it appears as a narrow finger of land jutting out into the water opposite the Newport district of the city. Control of Westerplatte meant control over an important approach to the inner harbour. Any ships entering or leaving Danzig would pass near this peninsula. In 1924, the League of Nations authorised Poland to establish a military transit depot on Westerplatte. Officially, this depot existed to store and transfer military supplies that were shipped by sea to Poland. In practice, it also served as a small but symbolically important Polish outpost inside a city that was otherwise dominated by German political forces. The depot was opened in 1926. According to international agreements, the Polish garrison was supposed to be very small, limited to fewer than 100 men, lightly armed and without heavy fortifications. From the very beginning, the presence of Polish soldiers on Westerplatte irritated German nationalists in Danzig. Many local politicians and activists saw the depot as an insult, a reminder of German defeat in 1918 and of Polish rights that they considered unjust. Over the years, there were repeated political disputes about the size of the garrison, the weapons stored there, and the extent of Polish authority. German newspapers in Danzig frequently attacked the depot in their articles and described it as a foreign military base on German soil. For Poland, however, Westerplatte had a significance that went beyond its small size. It was one of the few points where the Polish state had a direct physical presence on the Baltic coast outside its own territory. It allowed Poland to receive military shipments in a port that was more developed than the young Polish port being built at Gdynia. It also had psychological meaning. The sight of the Polish flag flying over the depot at Westerplatte symbolised Poland's right to exist and to trade on the Baltic Sea, in spite of German hostility. During the 1930s, the political climate in Europe changed dramatically. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, and from that moment on, the status of Danzig and the Polish corridor became central issues in German foreign policy. German leaders demanded the return of Danzig to the Reich and the creation of an extraterritorial road and railway across the Polish corridor. The Polish government refused these demands because they would have weakened Poland's independence and its security. As tension grew, Danzig became a focus of propaganda campaigns. Nazi organisations in the Free City gained strength, and the Senate of Danzig, influenced by them, increasingly challenged Polish rights. The presence of the Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte, with its small guard unit, became even more controversial. German authorities questioned shipments, delayed trains, and inspected cargo in ways that were meant to apply constant pressure. The Polish side responded quietly but decisively. Although the international agreement limited the size and armament of the garrison, Polish officers gradually strengthened the defences of Westerplatte in secret. Under cover of night or under the pretext of normal cargo, they brought in additional soldiers and weapons. By 1939, the real number of Polish defenders on Westerplatte was more than double the official limit. They had prepared hidden bunkers, reinforced guardhouses and communication trenches. The peninsula, which looked from a distance like a wooded park with a few warehouse buildings, was in fact a small fortress. From a purely military point of view, Westerplatte was not a major base. It was small, isolated, and within easy range of German artillery in Danzig and along the coast. If Germany decided to attack Poland, Westerplatte was unlikely to hold out for long without help from the outside. However, the symbolic and political importance of the site was far greater than its physical size. It stood at the crossroads of several crucial questions: control of the Baltic, the status of Danzig, the enforcement of the post-war treaties, and the willingness of Poland to resist German demands. By the late summer of 1939, it had become increasingly clear that war was likely. German propaganda intensified accusations against Poland. Fabricated incidents along the border were planned in order to provide excuses for a military attack. In the harbour of Danzig, the old German battleship Schleswig-Holstein arrived on what was officially described as a friendly courtesy visit. The ship anchored close to Westerplatte. Polish officers understood that this was a threat, but they had limited options. The garrison on the peninsula was reinforced as much as possible, and its commander prepared his men for the possibility of an attack. Thus, on the eve of the Second World War, Westerplatte represented far more than a storage depot. It was a fragile but stubborn symbol of Polish sovereignty inside a hostile environment, a small patch of land where two conflicting visions of Europe stood face to face. When the first shots were fired there in the early hours of 1 September 1939, the attack on this tiny peninsula marked not only the beginning of a local battle, but also the violent opening of a global conflict. When you are ready, you can ask me to write part 2 about Polish preparations and the German plan of attack. By the late 1930s, both Poland and Germany understood that Westerplatte could become a flashpoint in any future conflict. The peninsula was small in size, but it carried a weight of symbolism and strategic value that far exceeded its physical dimensions. As the European crisis deepened, the Polish garrison on Westerplatte quietly prepared for the worst, while German planners designed a rapid and overwhelming assault that they believed would crush resistance in a matter of hours. On the Polish side, the military transit depot functioned outwardly as a modest logistical installation. Visitors could see warehouses, administrative buildings, a small barracks, and a few guard posts scattered among trees and sandy paths. According to international agreements, the depot was allowed only a limited number of soldiers, lightly armed, with no heavy artillery and no serious fortifications. On paper, the garrison was supposed to be little more than a security detail for stored supplies. In reality, Polish authorities had long since decided that Westerplatte would be defended if war broke out. Polish intelligence and political leaders watched the rise of National Socialism with increasing alarm. They saw the growing influence of Nazi organisations in the free city of Danzig, the aggressive rhetoric about revising borders, and the specific hostility directed at Polish rights in the harbour. Step by step, and with great secrecy, they transformed Westerplatte from a nominal depot into a small fortress. The key figure in these preparations was the Polish military command responsible for the coastal area, supported by engineers and officers who understood both the limitations of the treaties and the practical demands of defence. They knew that they could not openly build large bunkers or emplace heavy guns without provoking an international crisis. Instead, they relied on concealment and careful planning. Under cover of routine shipments and maintenance work, Polish officers brought extra soldiers onto the peninsula and kept them there. Official documents continued to list the garrison at a lower number, but by 1939 the real strength was more than 150 men, with some sources giving a figure of around 180. These men were carefully selected. Many were experienced non-commissioned officers and well-trained infantrymen, accustomed to discipline and prepared to endure hardship. The organisation of the garrison combined military efficiency with a sense of close community. The men lived and worked in a confined space, cut off from the surrounding city by political hostility and by the water that encircled much of the peninsula. They shared daily routines, drills and maintenance tasks, but they also developed strong bonds of loyalty and mutual trust. Their commanders understood that in an emergency, morale would be as important as weapons. Commander Westerplatte rested with Major Henryk Sucharski, a professional officer of the Polish army. He had a calm, serious manner and a reputation for responsibility. Serving under him as his deputy was Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski, who was energetic and deeply committed to the defence of the position. Together, they shaped a defensive plan that assumed isolation. They did not expect immediate relief if war began. Instead, they aimed to hold as long as possible, to tie down German forces, and to provide a powerful symbol of resistance. The physical defences of Westerplatte were developed with these goals in mind. Polish engineers constructed reinforced guardhouses made of concrete and partially sunk into the ground, camouflaged among trees and shrubs. These guardhouses were more than simple posts. They were hardened positions with firing slits, internal compartments, and communication links. Trenches connected some of these points, allowing soldiers to move under partial cover. Barbed wire obstacles and prepared fields of fire were laid out, although they remained partly hidden from casual observation. Inside the depot, ammunition, food, and medical supplies were stockpiled with an eye toward a prolonged siege. Since heavy artillery was forbidden, the defenders relied on rifles, machine guns, light mortars, and a small number of field guns that could be concealed. The idea was not to match German firepower on equal terms, but to make every approach costly, to survive bombardment in protected positions, and to surprise attackers who underestimated the strength of the garrison. On the German side, Westerplatte had become a target not only because of its symbolic value, but also because it lay in the path of a larger strategic plan. Adolf Hitler had decided to attack Poland, and the German High Command had drawn up detailed plans for a rapid campaign that would crush Polish resistance before foreign powers could intervene effectively. The assault on Westerplatte would be one of the first actions of this wider war, designed to demonstrate German strength and to eliminate a Polish military presence in the harbour of Danzig. German planners believed that Westerplatte could be taken quickly through a combination of surprise, heavy firepower, and psychological shock. The old battleship Schleswig-Holstein was assigned a central role. Officially, it sailed into the harbour of Danzig on a courtesy visit in August 1939, a gesture meant to appear ceremonial and routine. The ship anchored near Westerplatte, its crew participating in social and political events in the city, while its officers made careful observations of the Polish depot across the water. In secret, the Schleswig-Holstein carried a landing force of German Marines and naval infantry, equipped for a sudden assault. These troops were reinforced by local units in Danzig, including police, paramilitary formations, and elements of special units that were ready to support the operation. Artillery pieces and mortars were positioned in the area, and plans were made for additional support from German air units once the general attack on Poland began. The concept of the German plan at Westerplatte was straightforward. In the early hours of the chosen day before dawn, the battleship would open fire on the Polish positions at close range, using its main guns and secondary batteries to shock and demoralise the defenders. Almost immediately after this bombardment, the landing force would move in, crossing a narrow canal and attacking the depot from the landward side, where the peninsula connected to the rest of the shoreline. With the help of local forces attacking from another direction, the German command expected the defenders to be overwhelmed in a matter of hours. German officers assessed the garrison according to the limitations written into international agreements. They assumed that there were fewer than 100 Polish soldiers with light weapons and weak defensive structures. Many believed that after a heavy naval bombardment, resistance would be minimal. The operation was planned with confidence, and time estimates for the capture of Westerplatte were measured in hours, not days. However, there were factors that German planners underestimated or misunderstood. They did not fully recognise the extent of Polish secret preparations, the strength of the hidden bunkers, or the depth of the communication trenches. They were not aware of the true number of defenders or of their determination to resist. Some German intelligence officers had suspicions, but the dominant assumption remained that the depot was a fragile outpost that would collapse quickly under pressure. As August 1939 drew to a close, tension in the region reached a breaking point. In the city of Danzig, Nazi flags flew prominently, and anti-Polish demonstrations were encouraged. Behind the scenes, orders were finalised and timetables confirmed. The Schleswig-Holstein remained in the harbour, its guns trained silently in directions that only a few insiders understood. On the Polish side, Major Sucharski and Captain Dombrowski issued quiet instructions to their men, inspected positions, and checked weapons and supplies. The Polish defenders knew that they were surrounded by hostile territory, and that in the event of war they would have to stand alone. Many of them wrote letters, made personal preparations, or spent time in reflection. There was no illusion about the imbalance of forces, Yet there was also a strong sense of duty. They were there to hold a line, however small, at the very entrance to the harbour. By the final night of August, the stage was set. Polish preparations and German planning had both run their course. The defenders waited in their camouflage positions, while the attackers waited on deck, in barracks, and behind artillery pieces, ready for the signal to fire. What would follow, in the early hours of 1 September 1939, would be the opening bombardment and the first assaults on Westerplatte, events that would shatter the silence of the harbour and announce to the world that war in Europe had begun again. When you're ready, you can ask me to write part 3 about the opening bombardment on 1 September 1939. In the early hours of 1 September 1939, the harbour of Danzig lay under a heavy expectant silence. The sky above the Baltic Sea was still dark with only the faintest hint of approaching dawn. On the water, the outline of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein loomed over the quieter shapes of smaller vessels and harbour structures. On the narrow wooded peninsula of Westerplatte, Polish sentries stood at their posts, listening to the ordinary sounds of the night and to the restless movements from the German ship that had anchored nearby under the pretence of a friendly visit. Shortly before the appointed time, the atmosphere on board the Schleswig-Holstein changed from routine to readiness. Orders were passed quietly. The guns of the ship, which had been silent during its days in port, were now manned and trained on the Polish depot. Shells were loaded, range and elevation were checked. German officers and gunners knew that the volley they were about to fire would not be a simple local action. It would be, by design, among the first shots of a new European war. On Westerplatte, Major Henryk Sucharski and his officers remained alert. The presence of the German warship had been a source of constant concern ever since its arrival. Reports had circulated of unusual activity, of Marines on board, of meetings in Danzig that felt more like war councils than ceremonies. Polish defenders slept in their uniforms near their positions. Weapons were kept ready. The garrison had been on heightened alert, but even so, the moment when night gives way to fire always has an element of shock. At dawn, around the time that clocks in Poland marked the approach of 5 in the morning, the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire. The first salvo of heavy shells arced through the dim light and crashed into the peninsula. The sudden roar shattered the quiet of the harbour. Explosions tore through trees, sand and buildings. Earthen splinters shot into the air. Windows in the city shook, and residents who were already awake, or who were thrown from sleep, understood with a terrible clarity that the long-feared war had begun. The German naval gunners aimed their fire at known and suspected Polish positions, guardhouses, barracks and warehouse structures. The idea was to stun the defenders, to break their organisation before the first infantry assault even reached the shore. The bombardment was short in duration but intense in its violence. Dust, smoke, and the smell of burning materials spread over Westerplatte. Trees were snapped, walls cracked, and some above-ground structures suffered serious damage. Inside the Polish depot, the experience for the men was abrupt and disorienting. Those in exposed positions threw themselves to the ground or sought shelter as the first shells landed. Those in underground or reinforced posts felt the shock of impacts as vibrations that shook walls and ceilings. For a moment, communication lines were interrupted, and it was not immediately clear how much damage had been done. However, the preparations that had been made in previous years now showed their value. The reinforced guardhouses, sunk partially into the ground and built of thick concrete, withstood the initial bombardment far better than an outside observer might have expected. Camouflage and dispersion meant that not all positions could be precisely targeted. While some buildings burned or were severely damaged, the core defensive structures remained in action. Within minutes, Polish officers and non-commissioned officers began to restore order, check their men, and prepare to repel the expected land attack. Almost immediately after the naval guns opened fire, the German ground assault began. From the area near the harbour and along the narrow neck of land that connected Westerplatte to the mainland, detachments of German Marines and local forces moved forward. They advanced under the cover of the ship's artillery and supporting fire from field guns and mortars positioned on the shore. Their objective was to break through the main gate area of the depot, push along the central paths, and seize key buildings and positions. The geography of Westerplatte shaped the battle from the first moments. The peninsula was long and relatively narrow, with wooded areas, small clearings, and man-made structures scattered across its surface. The main entrance from the landward side was protected by Polish positions that had been carefully sited to cover likely approaches. Barbed wire, obstacles, and fields of fire had been prepared. To the Germans, who believed that the depot was only lightly defended, the terrain might have appeared challenging but manageable. As the first German assault troops moved forward, they encountered a reality quite different from their expectations. Polish defenders in the guardhouses and trenches near the gate remained functional after the bombardment. When the attackers reached the outer edges of the Polish defensive zone, machine guns and rifles opened up from concealed positions. The air filled with the sound of gunfire, the cracking of bullets through branches, and the shouts of men taking cover or urging each other forward. Polish fire was disciplined and well directed. The defenders knew their sectors, their targets, and the ranges. They had rehearsed these scenarios for months, even years. They understood that their best chance lay in using every advantage of concealment and cover in making each bullet count. German troops, who had expected a demoralized or shattered enemy, found themselves caught in a surprisingly intense crossfire. The approach areas near the gate and along the railway embankment became deadly zones, where progress was measured in meters and paid for at a high cost. Several attempts were made to push deeper into the depot. German assault groups tried to use shell craters, ditches, and remnants of vegetation as cover. They attempted flanking movements where possible. Some advanced to within short distances of Polish positions, only to be driven back by concentrated fire or by counterattacks from small Polish groups who left their shelters at critical moments. Grenades and close-range combat added to the confusion and danger of the first hours. From the perspective of the Polish defenders, the situation was extremely tense but not yet hopeless. The initial bombardment had caused casualties and damage, but the main defensive system remained intact. Communication between key posts, although sometimes interrupted by physical destruction of lines, was restored as runners and alternative methods were employed. Major Sucharski and Captain Dombrowski worked to maintain control, to move reserves where needed, and to encourage their men to hold their ground. On the German side, shock began to replace the earlier confidence. Reports from the front indicated that the enemy was not collapsing. Instead, the defenders were inflicting serious losses and maintaining their positions. The assumption that Westerplatte would fall in a few hours started to look doubtful. German commanders ordered additional fire from artillery and mortars onto suspected strongpoints. Smoke and dust rose once more above the trees, obscuring visibility and adding to the chaos on the ground. As the first day of fighting continued, the pattern of the battle became clearer. The Germans enjoyed overwhelming superiority in heavy weapons. They could call on naval guns, field artillery, and, when necessary, air support. They could rotate units and bring in fresh assault troops from the surrounding area. The Poles, by contrast, were confined to their limited space, with a fixed number of men and finite supplies. However, in the crucial early hours, the qualities that had been cultivated in the garrison made a decisive difference. Training, preparation, and morale allowed the defenders to transform their small peninsula into a stubborn stronghold. By late morning on 1 September, the initial German plan for a quick capture of Westerplatte had clearly failed. The landing force had been forced back from the main approaches, and attempts to penetrate deeper into the depot had cost more men than expected. The Schleswig-Holstein continued to fire at intervals, targeting specific positions or responding to requests from forward observers, but the Polish defence was not broken. During pauses in the fighting, inside the surviving Polish bunkers and guardhouses, men caught their breath, bandaged wounds, and prepared for renewed assaults. The knowledge that they had survived the first shock, and that they had repulsed the initial attack of a much stronger enemy, gave many of them a sense of grim pride. They knew that the odds remained heavily against them, but they also understood that each hour of resistance carried significance far beyond the narrow boundaries of Westerplatte. In the wider world, news of the bombardment and of the German attack on Poland began to spread. Radio broadcasts and government announcements in various capitals informed populations that hostilities had begun. For the people of Poland, the name Westerplatte quickly became associated with the opening of the war. For the men on the peninsula itself, however, there was no time for reflection or symbolic interpretation. There were new orders, new bursts of shell fire, and new waves of attackers to face. By the end of that first day, the outlines of the struggle were set. Westerplatte had not fallen in the few hours that German planners had confidently forecast. The The Polish defenders, though bloodied and isolated, still held their positions among ruined trees, shattered buildings and smoking craters. The German command, surprised by this resistance, would now turn to heavier methods and repeated assaults in the days that followed, determined to crush this small, stubborn outpost. When you're ready, you can ask me to write part 4 about the repeated German assaults and the Polish defence during days 2 to 4 of the battle. The morning of 2 September 1939 rose over a landscape that had already been transformed by war. The wooded peninsula of Westerplatte, which had once resembled a quiet park with warehouses and sandy paths, now bore the scars of shells and bullets. Trees were shattered or burning, walls were cracked or collapsed, craters pitted the sandy soil. Yet inside the surviving Polish positions, the defenders remained at their posts. They had endured the first shock and had proven that they would not be swept away in a single blow. For the German command, this situation was unacceptable. Westerplatte was supposed to have fallen quickly. Its continued resistance was both a military inconvenience and a political embarrassment. German authorities in Danzig and in Berlin wanted a decisive result. As a consequence, the second day of the battle was marked by an escalation in both firepower and determination. Early on, 2 September, the Germans launched new infantry assaults against the Polish positions. Once again, troops advanced toward the main gate area and along other approaches, supported by artillery and mortar fire. They attempted to exploit any damage that had been done the previous day, seeking weak points in the perimeter where barbed wire had been blown apart or where trenches had been partially collapsed. However, the Polish defenders had used the short pauses in the fighting to repair and reorganize. Men who had survived the first day adjusted firing positions, reinforced damaged walls, and cleared fields of fire as best they could. Communication between guardhouses and the central command post, although sometimes interrupted, was restored whenever possible by runners or by quickly repaired lines. When the German infantry pushed forward, they again encountered a network of concealed firing points that delivered accurate and disciplined fire. The result was similar to the previous day. German assault groups suffered heavy losses for limited gains. Some managed to reach the outer edges of Polish positions, only to be driven back by counterfire and grenades. Others found themselves pinned down in open or partially sheltered ground, unable to move without attracting a hail of bullets. The stubbornness of the defence surprised many German soldiers, who had been told that the depot was lightly held and poorly fortified. Recognising that infantry attacks alone would not be sufficient, the German command decided to bring in much heavier aerial support. On 2 September, a significant airstrike was directed against Westerplatte. Dive bombers, the feared aircraft that had already become infamous in other early operations, were sent to hammer the Polish positions from above. These planes dove steeply toward their targets, releasing bombs with terrifying accuracy and accompanied by the unnerving sound of their sirens, designed to break enemy morale. The bombing raid inflicted serious destruction. Several Polish positions were struck directly. Buildings that had already been damaged by naval and artillery fire were further shattered or set ablaze. The sandy soil erupted into clouds of dust and debris. The defenders in exposed areas suffered new casualties. Even men in reinforced positions felt the violence of the impacts as ceilings shook and fragments rattled against concrete. For a moment it seemed possible that such overwhelming force might finally crush the resistance. Fires burned and smoke drifted across the peninsula. Trees that had survived the first day now splintered or fell. The visual impression of Westerplatte after the airstrike was that of a devastated, burning outpost. German observers watching from a distance believed that no organised resistance could remain. Yet once again, the hidden strength of the Polish preparations and the determination of the garrison made themselves felt. Although the bombing caused heavy damage and added to the list of dead and wounded, many of the core defensive structures endured. Underground shelters and reinforced guardhouses designed specifically to withstand bombardment protected their occupants from the full force of the explosions. When the smoke and dust began to clear, German infantry moved forward in the belief that the defenders had been annihilated. They were mistaken. From ruined tree lines and from half-shattered bunkers, Polish machine guns and rifles opened fire once more. The defenders, deafened and shaken but alive, reoccupied firing positions and continued to resist. For the German troops, the shock of finding a living, organised enemy in the midst of such devastation was profound. They had anticipated a simple mopping up of scattered survivors. Instead, they faced yet another costly engagement. During the second and third days, the battle at Westerplatte took on a rhythm of assault and response. German artillery, mortars and naval guns pounded suspected strongpoints. Infantry units then moved in, attempting to exploit the damage. The Poles, sheltered as best they could, endured the barrages and then emerged to fire on attacking troops when they came within range. The small size of the peninsula meant that there was almost no place truly safe from shelling, but it also allowed the defenders to shift men relatively quickly between threatened sectors. Conditions inside the Polish garrison steadily worsened. Casualties mounted. Some positions were destroyed beyond use and had to be abandoned. Ammunition had to be conserved carefully and distributed to where it was most needed. Medical supplies were limited, and wounded men received treatment in cramped and often dangerous conditions, sometimes under continuing bombardment. Sleep was scarce and fragmented. The constant noise of explosions, gunfire and aircraft attacks created severe psychological strain. Despite these hardships, morale did not collapse. The defenders understood the wider meaning of their stand. News from the outside world was scarce, but they knew that war had broken out along the entire Polish frontier. They could not know the exact situation of the Polish army elsewhere, but they were aware that every hour they held out forced the enemy to commit time and resources to a tiny patch of ground. Officers and non-commissioned officers continued to speak with their men, to encourage them, and to maintain discipline. Shared danger and shared hardship deepened the bonds of solidarity within the garrison. German commanders, frustrated by the unexpected duration of the fight, adjusted their tactics. They experimented with using flamethrowers and explosive charges to attack specific strongpoints. They tried to isolate individual guardhouses and destroy them one by one. They used loudspeakers and propaganda in an attempt to weaken Polish resolve, announcing that resistance was hopeless and that further fighting would only cause unnecessary suffering. These psychological efforts, however, had little effect on men who had already committed themselves to a desperate defence. By 3 and 4 September, the pattern of repeated attacks and stubborn resistance continued. The landscape of Westerplatte was now almost entirely stripped of its earlier appearance. Where there had been lush vegetation, there were now burned trunks and tangled wreckage. Where there had been orderly buildings and paths, there were now collapsed structures, scattered debris and a maze of craters and trenches. The peninsula resembled a battlefield from the worst days of the First World War, compressed into a very small space. Yet even in this devastated environment, the Polish defenders continued to fight from their surviving positions. Some outposts had been lost, and the defensive perimeter had been tightened, but the core of the garrison still held together under the leadership of Major Sucharski and his officers. The German timetable for the capture of Westerplatte was in ruins. What had been intended as a swift symbolic victory had turned into a prolonged and costly engagement that drew attention from military observers across Europe. For the men on the ground, however, these broader perceptions were distant. Their world was reduced to a few hundred meters of ruined land, to the next shell, the next assault, the next shouted order. Anxiety and exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but so did a growing sense of grim achievement. They had already held out far longer than anyone had expected. As days 2, 3, and 4 passed, the question ceased to be whether they would be overrun immediately and became instead how long such a small and isolated force could possibly endure under such continuous pressure. When you are ready, you can ask me to write part 5 about the escalation, the isolation, and the conditions inside the garrison during days 5 to 7 of the battle. As the battle for Westerplatte moved into its 5th, 6th and 7th days, it became less a single dramatic clash and more a test of endurance. What had begun as a sudden, violent assault with expectations of a quick outcome turned into a slow, grinding struggle in which both sides had to confront fatigue, frustration, and the physical limits of men and material on a very small, devastated piece of land. By the morning of 5 September 1939, the Polish defenders were living in conditions that would have been unimaginable only a week earlier. The wooded peninsula, once a quiet place of regular routines and modest military life, had been transformed into a shattered battlefield. Most of the trees that had provided shade and concealment were either burned or splintered. Buildings that had once housed offices, storage rooms and living quarters were smashed, roofless, or on fire. Piles of debris lay where walls and chimneys had stood. The ground was torn by overlapping shell craters, each filled with sand, fragments of wood and broken brick. Inside the surviving bunkers and guardhouses, the atmosphere was cramped, smoky and tense. The air carried the smells of damp earth, burned materials, sweat, gun oil, and sometimes blood. Men slept in short, uneasy intervals, often fully dressed with weapons within arm's reach. They woke to renewed shelling or to shouted orders, and they moved between firing positions and shelters through trenches that were themselves partially collapsed or filled with loose sand and rubble. The physical toll on the defenders was severe. Many were wounded, some seriously. Space for medical care was extremely limited. Makeshift infirmaries were set up in cellars or in the least damaged rooms of surviving structures. There, under the dim light of lanterns or candles, medics and fellow soldiers bandaged wounds, splinted broken limbs, and did what they could with scarce supplies. Morphine and other painkillers were in short supply. In some cases, wounded men chose to return to their positions as soon as they could stand and hold a weapon, unwilling to leave their comrades with fewer defenders on the line. Food and water also became growing concerns. The Polish garrison had prepared for a siege by stockpiling supplies, but no one had anticipated such an intense and prolonged bombardment. Some storage areas were destroyed early in the battle, others remained intact but were difficult or dangerous to reach. Moving supplies from one part of the depot to another often required crossing open ground under observation and potential fire. Men were forced to ration their food, eating cold, simple rations when time and circumstances permitted. Water, essential in the heat of exertion and under the stress of constant explosions, had to be conserved and distributed carefully. Sleep deprivation added another layer of strain. The defenders lived with almost continuous noise, artillery shells whistling and bursting, mortar bombs falling, machine guns chattering, rifles cracking, and from time to time the frightening shriek of dive bombers overhead. Even in brief lulls, the anticipation of the next attack made true rest nearly impossible. Minds and bodies stretched toward their limits, and yet the demands of defence did not allow for respite. Men who dozed off for a few minutes were soon shaken awake to man a position or respond to a new threat. At the same time, the emotional and psychological burdens grew heavier. The defenders knew that they were isolated. Radio contact with the outside world was limited and uncertain. Visual signs from beyond the peninsula were not encouraging. At night, they could sometimes see the glow of fires on the horizon, evidence of fighting and destruction in other parts of the region. They heard distant explosions and gunfire that told them war was raging far beyond their small outpost. Rumours spread quickly inside the garrison, as they do in any closed community under stress. Some believed that the Polish army was advancing somewhere else. Others feared that the main forces had been pushed back and that relief would not come. Communication from the outside, when it reached Westerplatte at all, was fragmentary. The defenders understood that they could not expect a large rescue operation. German forces around the free city of Danzig and along the coast were too strong, and the main Polish army was engaged in desperate battles elsewhere. This knowledge sharpened the sense that they stood alone. It also strengthened the meaning of their resistance. Every day they held out, they forced the enemy to commit time, ammunition and manpower to this small, stubborn stronghold. On the German side, frustration mounted. The continued existence of a Polish pocket of resistance at the entrance to the harbour of Danzig, under the guns of a German battleship and within reach of German artillery and aircraft, was both militarily inconvenient and politically embarrassing. German commanders increased the intensity of their efforts. More artillery pieces were brought to bear. Mortar fire probed and pounded surviving strongpoints. Engineers planned and executed attacks against particular bunkers, using explosives, flamethrowers, and concentrated charges in attempts to blast openings into the heart of the Polish positions. Psychological warfare also intensified. German loudspeakers, set up within hearing range of the Polish lines, broadcast messages urging surrender. They announced supposed developments in the wider war, claimed that the Polish army was collapsing, and argued that further resistance at Westerplatte was pointless and cruel to the defenders themselves. They promised honourable treatment for prisoners who laid down their arms. The aim was to break the will of the garrison. By the time the battle for Westerplatte entered its final phase, the small Polish garrison had already passed through a week of almost continuous strain. The peninsula was a landscape of ruins. Craters overlapped one another. Burned tree trunks stood like blackened skeletons against a sky streaked with smoke. Buildings that had once sheltered men, supplies and equipment were reduced to broken walls and piles of rubble. The defenders were exhausted in mind and body, yet they remained at their posts, still responding to new attacks with organised resistance. For the German command, the continued existence of this pocket of defiance had become intolerable. Westerplatte was supposed to have fallen on the first day. Instead, the Polish garrison had held out for many times that length. The delay did not change the overall course of the invasion of Poland, where large German formations were advancing rapidly on multiple fronts, but it created a symbolic challenge and a practical annoyance. The harbour of Danzig could not be fully secured while a Polish flag still flew over a burning, yet unbroken depot at its entrance. In response, German forces prepared a final, concentrated effort to break the defence. Artillery was massed with greater precision. Observers had spent days studying the remaining Polish positions, noting which bunkers still fired, where movement could be seen, and which ruins seemed to conceal functioning strongpoints. Mortars were positioned to hit trenches and communication lines. Engineers readied explosive charges and flamethrowers for attacks at close range. The aim was to crush the last organised resistance in a sustained and overwhelming assault. For the defenders, the approach of this final storm could be felt in many ways. The frequency and weight of artillery fire increased. Shells fell with particular intensity on positions that had already been damaged, as if the enemy meant to erase them completely. The already devastated landscape was churned again and again. Structures that had survived earlier bombardments were now shattered. In some shelters, ceilings collapsed. In others, cracks widened and dust drifted constantly from above, a visible sign that concrete and earth were reaching their limits. Inside the garrison, casualties had reached a level that could no longer be hidden or managed as before. A significant portion of the defenders were dead, lying in hastily prepared graves or in places where it had been impossible to move their bodies under fire. Many others were wounded, some lightly, others severely. Medical supplies were almost exhausted. Bandages were reused when possible, painkillers were scarce. The small makeshift infirmaries were overcrowded. Groans and laboured breathing filled their cramped interiors. Ammunition had also become a critical concern. The defenders had rationed it carefully throughout the battle, but every day of fighting consumed precious rounds. Machine gun belts, rifle cartridges, mortar shells and grenades had been used in large quantities. Some types of ammunition were nearly depleted. In several positions, soldiers found themselves counting each remaining round and weighing every shot against the need to conserve some measure of firepower for the next assault. The knowledge that they could soon be unable to respond effectively to an attack added a heavy psychological burden. It was under these circumstances that Major Henryk Sucharski and his officers faced their hardest decision. They had already accomplished far more than any outside observer had expected. The garrison had held out not for hours but for days. They had inflicted significant losses, forced repeated German assaults, and demonstrated the resilience of Polish arms in a dramatic and highly visible way. The defence of Westerplatte had become a symbol of national courage. The question now was what further resistance could realistically achieve. On one side of this dilemma stood the ideal of fighting to the last, of refusing surrender under any circumstances, and of turning Westerplatte into a final, tragic act of complete sacrifice. On the other side stood the responsibility of a commander toward the lives of his men. Major Sucharski had to consider whether continued resistance, in the face of overwhelming enemy superiority, almost non-existent supplies, and no hope of relief, would serve any meaningful military purpose, or whether it would simply result in the death of the remaining defenders without changing the outcome of the wider war. Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski and other officers were deeply committed to continuing the fight. They believed that every additional hour of resistance had moral and symbolic value. Their determination and their personal courage had played a major role in sustaining the defence through the earlier days of the battle. At the same time, even they could see the mounting cost in blood and the shrinking resources. Discussions within the command group were intense. In such situations, there are no easy answers, only difficult choices among different forms of loss. While these internal debates took place, German artillery continued to fall on the peninsula. The final bombardments were among the heaviest of the entire battle. The ground shook with repeated impacts. The air was filled with dust, smoke, and flying fragments. Flames burst from buildings that still contained flammable material. Trenches caved in. Some bunkers became partially buried. The defenders crouched in their shelters, listening to the roar of explosions and feeling the world tremble around them, aware that the physical structures on which their survival depended were being battered dangerously close to collapse. In this environment, communication between positions became even more difficult. Runners who had previously risked crossing open ground now found those paths even more exposed and obstructed by new craters and debris. Telephone lines that had been repaired many times were severed again. Messages passed slowly, sometimes by shouted word during brief lulls or by signals agreed upon earlier in the battle. The command post had a less and less complete picture of the situation in all sectors of the shrinking perimeter. At a certain point, the reality of the situation could no longer be denied. The garrison was on the edge of physical and material exhaustion. Many of the most important positions were heavily damaged or threatened with complete destruction. Ammunition stocks were close to the point where effective resistance would become impossible. The number of wounded men, many of them unable to be evacuated or treated properly, weighed on the conscience of the command. The German enemy, by contrast, retained overwhelming superiority in artillery, manpower, and the ability to bring fresh units and equipment into the fight. Major Sucharski came to the conclusion that further resistance would no longer serve a rational military purpose. He decided that the time had come to surrender in order to save the lives of the remaining men. This decision did not mean that the courage of the garrison had failed. On the contrary, it reflected the fact that they had already reached the limits of what a small, isolated force could accomplish. To insist on fighting until every defender lay dead would not change the strategic situation. It would only add more names to the list of the fallen. When the decision had been made, preparations for surrender began amid the ongoing bombardment. According to customary practice, a white flag or other visible sign of capitulation needed to be displayed. In the midst of ruins and under fire, arranging this was not a simple matter, yet eventually a signal of surrender was shown to the German lines. Observers on the German side noticed it and informed their commanders. Orders were given to cease fire, and gradually the thunder of guns around Westerplatte fell silent for the first time in many days. The silence that followed must have seemed almost unreal to the men who had lived through the constant noise of shelling and gunfire. In that silence, German troops cautiously approached the Polish positions, ready for the possibility of deception but expecting to receive a formal capitulation. Polish officers and soldiers emerged from their ruined shelters, some limping, some supporting wounded comrades, many covered in dust and grime, all marked by fatigue. They carried their weapons in ways that signalled their readiness to lay them down. The formal act of surrender took place under the eyes of officers from both sides. Major Henryk Sucharski presented himself to the German commander to offer capitulation. Accounts from German participants describe a scene in which the Polish commander appeared exhausted but dignified. The German officers, who had initially expected an easy victory and had instead been forced into a prolonged and costly battle, now expressed respect for the courage and endurance of the defenders. In a gesture that later became famous, the German commander is reported to have allowed Major Sucharski to retain his ceremonial sword as a sign of honour for the bravery of his garrison. Polish soldiers were assembled, disarmed, and counted. The number of survivors, when compared to the original strength of the garrison, testified to the severity of the battle. Many men bore visible wounds, others were so tired that they could barely stand. Yet there was also a sense of grim pride among them. They knew that they had held out far longer than anyone had expected. They had done their duty under the most difficult conditions. Their surrender was not the collapse of a frightened force, but the final act of a unit that had given everything it reasonably could. German troops escorted the prisoners away from the ruins of Westerplatte. As they passed through areas that had once been familiar parts of their daily routine, the Polish defenders saw in full daylight the extent of the destruction. Places where they had walked, drilled, or shared conversations in peacetime were now unrecognizable fields of rubble and ash. The trees that had once shaded them were gone. Buildings that had housed their lives were reduced to broken masonry. The peninsula upon which they had struggled so long had been transformed into a monument of devastation. The German command took possession of the depot. Engineers and officers examined the surviving bunkers and fortifications. Many were surprised by the strength of the positions and by the cleverness of the Polish preparations. Hidden walls, reinforced ceilings, and well-placed firing points demonstrated that Westerplatte had been far more than a simple transit depot. It had been a carefully prepared strongpoint. This recognition increased German respect for the defenders, even as they celebrated the final capture of the position. For the men of the garrison, surrender marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter as prisoners of war. They faced transport to camps in Germany, interrogation, and an unknown future under enemy authority. However, they also carried with them the knowledge that their stand at Westerplatte had already entered the story of the war as an example of steadfast resistance. They had withstood bombardments from naval guns, artillery, and aircraft. They had repelled repeated assaults. They had endured isolation, hunger, and exhaustion. The decision to surrender, made at the point where continued fighting would only have meant pointless death, did not erase any of that. The battle for Westerplatte was over. The guns in the harbour fell silent. Smoke continued to drift above the ruins for some time, a visible reminder of the struggle that had taken place there. In military terms, the small depot had finally been captured by the overwhelmingly stronger German forces. In moral and symbolic terms, however, Westerplatte had become something much greater than a tactical objective. It had become a symbol of a national courage and of the willingness of a small group of soldiers to hold their ground against enormous odds. When you are ready, you can ask me to write part 7 about the aftermath of the battle, German reactions, the treatment of the prisoners, and the long-term legacy of Westerplatte in Polish and world memory. When the last shots had faded and the Polish garrison of Westerplatte had laid down its arms, a heavy, almost unreal quiet settled over the ruined peninsula. For the first time in days, the men who had survived could hear something other than the constant thunder of explosions and the crack of gunfire. There were still the sounds of movement, of German troops taking positions, of orders being shouted, of engines and equipment, but the familiar violent rhythm of battle had stopped. The German forces moved quickly to secure the area. Patrols spread out across the peninsula, checking for any remaining pockets of resistance or unexploded charges. Engineers began to examine the defensive works that had held out so long. Officers walked through the battlefield, taking note of positions, fields of fire, and the construction of the bunkers. What they found deepened their respect for the defenders and helped to explain why Westerplatte had resisted for so many days. The Polish fortifications, which from a distance had seemed modest, and in some cases almost invisible, were revealed as carefully planned and solidly built. Reinforced concrete guardhouses, partially buried in the ground and skillfully camouflaged, had provided strong protection against shelling. Communication trenches, although damaged, had allowed movement under fire. Some positions showed signs of repeated repair and improvisation, evidence that the defenders had worked constantly to keep their defensive system functioning despite the bombardment. German officers who had initially believed that they were attacking a lightly defended depot now understood that they had faced a small but well-prepared fortress. Reports written after the battle noted the strength and ingenuity of the Polish positions. This recognition did not lessen the German claim of victory, but it did shape their view of the Polish garrison. The men who had held Westerplatte were no longer seen as simple guards caught off balance, but as disciplined soldiers who had fought with determination and skill. The treatment of the captured Poles reflected this grudging respect. After surrender, the surviving defenders were assembled, counted and searched. They were disarmed and placed under guard, but contemporary accounts from both sides describe scenes that went beyond simple procedure. Some German officers and soldiers expressed open admiration for the endurance of the garrison. There were handshakes and gestures of acknowledgement. The reported decision of the German commander to allow Major Henryk Sucharski to retain his ceremonial sword became a symbol of this respect, even if later historians have discussed the exact details of the incident. For the Polish prisoners, the immediate future was filled with uncertainty. They had lived for days in constant danger of death, and now they faced the unknown world of captivity. Many were wounded, some seriously. German medical personnel and Polish medics did what they could for the injured, within the limits of available supplies and the conditions of war. The prisoners were eventually transported from Westerplatte and sent to camps in Germany, where they joined the growing number of Polish soldiers captured in the first weeks of the campaign. As they left the peninsula, the defenders passed through the ruins that had been their home and their battlefield. They saw shattered bunkers where they had stood shoulder to shoulder, blackened trees that had once given them shade, and open ground where comrades had fallen. Each crater Each collapsed wall carried personal memories. For many of them, leaving Westerplatte meant leaving behind friends who would never return, as well as a part of their own lives that would forever be marked by those 7 days of struggle. In a broader sense, the fall of Westerplatte was only one episode in the larger war that was unfolding with terrifying speed across Poland. German armies, supported by armour and air power, were advancing on multiple fronts. The Polish army, fighting bravely but facing enormous material disadvantages and attacked from several directions, was under immense pressure. In the days that followed the surrender of Westerplatte, the focus of large-scale operations moved to other regions, to major cities and to open battlefields. Yet even as the war expanded, the story of Westerplatte began to take on a special meaning. In Germany, the propaganda apparatus presented the capture of the depot as a demonstration of German military efficiency and strength. Newspapers and newsreels showed images of the burning peninsula and of the captured Polish soldiers. However, the narrative could not entirely conceal the fact that the garrison had held out far longer than expected. The need to explain why a single small outpost had required so many days and such heavy firepower to subdue became part of the story. In Poland, both during the war and especially in the years that followed, Westerplatte became a symbol of the national spirit of resistance. News of the defence had already begun to spread even before the final surrender. Radio broadcasts and word of mouth carried reports that a tiny garrison near Danzig was still holding out under bombardment from a battleship, artillery and aircraft. For many Poles in those first dark days of the invasion, the knowledge that Westerplatte continued to fight offered a ray of pride and encouragement. After the defeat of Poland in 1939 and the subsequent occupation of the country by German and Soviet forces, the story of Westerplatte did not fade. Among soldiers who continued the fight abroad, among members of the resistance at home, and among Polish communities in exile, the defence of the depot became a point of reference. It demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming force, Polish soldiers had stood firm, inflicted losses, and forced the enemy to reckon with their determination. The idea that Westerplatte had defended itself for 7 days entered popular memory as a concise expression of courage at the very beginning of the war. The legacy of the battle was also shaped by the later political history of Poland. After the Second World War, when Poland emerged under a new political system and within a different international order, the story of Westerplatte continued to be honoured, although at times interpreted through changing ideological lenses. Monuments were erected on the peninsula. Museums and memorial sites were created to preserve the memory of the battle. Ceremonies were held to commemorate the anniversary of the outbreak of the war and the stand of the garrison. Visitors to Westerplatte in the post-war period could walk among the preserved ruins of bunkers and guardhouses, see the outlines of trenches, and look out over the same waters across which the battleship Schleswig-Holstein had once fired. Plaques and displays explained the events of those September days. The site became not only a historical location, but also a place of reflection on the suffering and sacrifice of the war as a whole. Historians, both in Poland and abroad, studied the battle in detail. They examined reports, orders, and personal accounts from both sides. They analysed the tactical and technical aspects of the defence and the assault. They discussed the decisions of commanders, the morale of the troops, and the role of Westerplatte in the wider context of the campaign of 1939. Some debates arose over particular points, such as the exact number of defenders, the sequence of certain assaults, or the internal dynamics within the command group. However, there was broad agreement on the essential facts. A small Polish garrison, prepared in secret and led with determination, had resisted far longer than anyone had predicted, under conditions of extreme pressure. The personal stories of individual defenders also entered the record. Memoirs, interviews, and testimonies revealed the human faces behind the statistics and the strategic analyses. Men described what it had felt like to crouch in a bunker as bombs fell, to carry a wounded comrade through shell fire, to listen to enemy loudspeakers promising safety in exchange for surrender, and to wrestle with fear and duty in the silence between bombardments. These accounts gave depth to the historical narrative, showing that the defence of Westerplatte was not an abstract event, but a series of lived experiences marked by pain, courage, doubt, and loyalty. In international memory, Westerplatte stands alongside other early battles of the Second World War as a symbol of resistance against aggression. While the scale of the fighting there was small compared to later campaigns, the timing and character of the battle gave it a special weight. It occurred in the first days of the war, at a moment when much of the world was still struggling to grasp the full implications of the German invasion of Poland. The image of a tiny outpost refusing to yield under fire from a far more powerful enemy resonated with broader themes of the conflict: the defence of sovereignty, the cost of resisting tyranny, and the human capacity to endure in desperate circumstances. For Poland in particular, Westerplatte became a foundational part of the national story of the Second World War. The phrase, "Westerplatte defended itself," entered schoolbooks, speeches, and cultural works. It served as a reminder that, even in a campaign that ended in national defeat and occupation, there were episodes of remarkable bravery and steadfastness. The memory of Westerplatte helped to sustain a sense of continuity and dignity through years of hardship and political upheaval. In the modern period, the site remains a place of pilgrimage and commemoration. Ceremonies marking the anniversary of the outbreak of the war often include moments of silence, the laying of wreaths, and speeches that recall the names and deeds of the defenders. Young people visit the peninsula to learn about the past. Veterans and families of those who fought there come to pay their respects. The preserved ruins, standing amid grass and pathways, speak silently to visitors about the violence that once tore through that narrow piece of land. In reflecting on the legacy of Westerplatte, one can see how a relatively small military engagement became a symbol that reaches far beyond its immediate tactical significance. The battle did not change the outcome of the September campaign. It did not halt the German invasion, yet its impact lies in another realm. It shows what a small group of determined individuals can do when faced with overwhelming force. It demonstrates that courage and duty can leave a mark on history, even when the larger strategic picture is unfavourable. The defenders of Westerplatte did not choose the moment when history would turn its gaze upon them. They found themselves in a position whose symbolic importance grew as international tension sharpened. When war came, they responded by doing their duty to the utmost of their ability. Their stand, measured in days and in the small area of a single peninsula, has been remembered for decades as an example of honour in the face of impossible odds. Thus, the story of Westerplatte does not end with the surrender and the transport of prisoners. It continues in the memory of a nation and in the wider understanding of the tragedy and heroism of the Second World War. The ruined bunkers and memorials on that narrow strip of land near Danzig remind us that history is often shaped not only by grand strategies and vast armies, but also by small groups of men who choose to stand their ground when events demand extraordinary courage.